In a quiet little town surrounded by fields and dusty roads, there lived a boy who loved music more than anything in the world. He didn't have much, not even a proper home some days. But what he did have was a dream that refused to die. He would sit by the window at night listening to the faint sounds from the neighbor's radio, trying to figure out every note, every rhythm. His fingers would move in the air as if he were already playing on a grand piano. But in truth, he had never even touched one. The boy's family couldn't afford lessons or instruments. His father worked long hours fixing old engines, while his mother took sewing jobs from anyone who needed clothes mended. Life was simple, and money was always short. Still, no matter how tired everyone was, the boy would hum tunes in the small kitchen while his mother cooked. His father would smile quietly, saying, "One day you'll play those songs for the world." He didn't know how that would ever happen. The closest thing he had to a piano was an old keyboard he had found in the trash behind a school. The keys didn't work and the wire was broken, but he took it home and cleaned it up as best he could. He opened it piece by piece, replaced broken buttons with parts from discarded electronics, and made it playable again, in his own way. At first it made terrible sounds. Some notes were too high, others too low, and sometimes it just made a crackling noise. But he didn't give up. He kept fixing it, learning how it worked, until one evening a soft melody came out. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make him smile. He finally had something he could call his piano. From that day on, he practiced every single evening. The tiny room where he lived would glow dimly under a single bulb, and the sound of his rough little piano filled the silence. The neighbors heard it too. At first they laughed a bit. "That thing sounds like a broken toy," one said. But then they started listening. There was something in the way he played, something real, full of feeling. An old lady from across the street once said, "That boy plays like he's telling a story." She wasn't wrong. Every sound he made came from his heart. He didn't have sheet music or formal training. He played what he felt: sadness, hope, love, and longing, all mixed into melodies that no one had ever written down before. There was one person who truly believed in him, his school music teacher. She was old and kind, and though she had seen many talented students, she said there was something different about him. One day after class, she called him over and asked, "Would you like to perform in the city's annual music audition? It's where the best young musicians go to show their talent. If you do well, you could win a place at the academy." The boy froze. Him? At a city audition? Against real pianists who practiced on shiny grand pianos and studied with famous teachers? It sounded impossible. "I don't think I belong there," he said quietly. "I don't even have a real piano." The teacher smiled. "You have something more important. You have music in your soul. That's something not everyone has." Her words stayed with him long after she left the classroom. That night, as he sat by his broken keyboard, he thought about it again and again. Maybe she was right. Maybe the world needed to hear his story through his music. And maybe it didn't matter what kind of piano he used. Maybe what mattered was how he played it. So, he decided to try. The next few months were the hardest of his life. He worked after school to save money for the trip to the city. He cleaned cars, carried groceries, and helped his father at the workshop. Every coin he earned went into a small tin box, and every night he practiced until his fingers ached. He played under the flickering light when power cuts hit the town, using candles when it got too dark. He didn't care. He just kept going. Sometimes his mother would tell him to rest. "You'll get sick if you don't sleep," she'd say. But he would shake his head and reply softly, "Just one more song, Mama. I almost have it." His determination spread through the neighborhood. People who once laughed now stopped by to listen. Children would sit outside his window, swaying to the rhythm. Even his father, who rarely showed emotion, would close his eyes when his son played. One night, his father came home with a surprise, a small used speaker he had repaired. "Maybe this will make your piano sound a little better," he said with a proud grin. The boy hugged him tightly. It wasn't a grand piano, but it was the best gift he could have asked for. Finally, the day of the audition arrived. The teacher gave him the address, a smile, and a small envelope with enough money for the bus ride. "Don't be afraid," she said. "Just play from your heart." The boy didn't sleep that night. He packed his old keyboard carefully into a cloth bag and stared at the stars through his window. He thought about everything, his parents' sacrifices, his teacher's faith, and all the nights he played alone. "Bikey, tomorrow," he whispered to himself. "They'll hear me." The bus ride to the city was long and noisy. He had never been there before. The tall buildings, the crowds, the fast cars, everything looked so different from his quiet town. He clutched his bag tightly, afraid someone might laugh if they saw his old keyboard. When he reached the academy, his heart raced. The building was enormous, with marble floors and shiny walls. Musicians from all over were waiting in the hall, dressed neatly, carrying real instruments, violins, guitars, even expensive pianos. Their instruments gleamed under the bright lights. He stood quietly in one corner, feeling out of place. Some contestants looked at him curiously. One whispered to another, "Is he really going to play that thing?" referring to his patched-up keyboard. He pretended not to hear. Then the door opened, and the director walked in, a tall man in a black suit with sharp eyes. Everyone went silent. He was known for his strictness and rarely smiled. When he spoke, his voice was calm but cold. "Let's begin," he said. One by one, the contestants performed. Their music was beautiful, perfect, and polished. The judges clapped politely after each performance, but the boy could feel his heart pounding harder with every turn. Finally, it was his name they called. He stepped onto the stage holding his little keyboard. The director's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he asked, pointing. "My piano," the boy answered softly. The director raised an eyebrow. "You call that a piano?" His tone was full of disbelief, almost mocking. A few people in the audience chuckled quietly. The boy felt his face burn with embarrassment. For a moment, he thought about turning around and leaving. But then he remembered his teacher's words. "Play from your heart." He took a deep breath, placed the keyboard on the stand, and sat down. The room was silent. Everyone waited, expecting a disaster. His fingers trembled as he touched the first key. A soft, uneven sound came out. Some people smiled in amusement. The director leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. But the boy closed his eyes and began to play. At first it was quiet, a gentle melody that seemed too small for such a grand hall. But slowly the music grew stronger. His fingers moved faster, and every note carried emotion. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It told a story, of struggle, of hope, of a dream that refused to die. People stopped whispering. The hall grew still. Even the director's expression softened, though he didn't realize it yet. The sound that came from that broken keyboard was not about skill or wealth. It was about feeling. The melody rose, like a voice that had been silent too long, finally finding its strength. And as he played the final note, his hands shaking, the last sound lingered in the air. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The boy didn't dare look up. He thought he had failed. He thought the laughter would start again. But instead, there was silence, deep and heavy, the kind that only follows something unforgettable. And somewhere in that silence, the director slowly stood up. For a few seconds after the last note faded, the whole room stayed quiet. The boy sat frozen, afraid to lift his head. He could still feel the director's eyes on him, sharp and unreadable. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it echoing in his ears. He wanted to believe he had done well, but part of him feared the silence meant disappointment. Then the director spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "Play it again." The boy blinked, unsure if he had heard right. The judges exchanged looks, surprised. Usually, when the director said those words, it meant one of two things. Either he was interested or he wanted to prove a point. No one could tell which it was. "Go on," the director repeated, folding his arms. "Play it again," the boy nodded nervously. He placed his trembling fingers on the chipped keys and started once more. This time he didn't think about the people watching. He just played. The same tune filled the hall again, soft at first, then rising and flowing like a story being told for the second time but with more confidence. Halfway through, something changed. The director leaned forward. His serious face relaxed a little. The other judges, who had been writing notes earlier, stopped and simply listened. The sound was still imperfect, a crackle here, a dull note there, but the feeling behind it reached every person in the room. When the boy finished, the director walked slowly toward him. The boy's hands dropped from the keys and he stood up nervously. The director stopped right in front of the small patched-up keyboard and bent down to look at it closely. "You made this?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," the boy replied. "It's all I have." The director straightened up, still staring at the instrument. His expression softened and he let out a small sigh. "You know," he said, "I've judged hundreds of auditions. I've heard pianos worth more than this entire building. But I don't remember the last time I felt something this real." The boy didn't know what to say. He just stood there, clutching his hands together. One of the other judges, a woman with kind eyes, smiled gently and said, "What's your name again?" He told her. She wrote it down carefully, then whispered something to the director. The director nodded but didn't say anything. "Thank you," the director finally said to the boy. "You can go now." The boy picked up his keyboard, bowed politely, and walked out. His legs felt weak and his chest felt heavy with emotion. Outside the hall, he sat down on a bench, trying to catch his breath. The sunlight was bright, but everything felt like a blur. Had he done well? He couldn't tell. The director hadn't smiled, but he also hadn't laughed. Maybe that was a good sign. Maybe not. The boy closed his eyes and thought of his family back home. He wanted to make them proud. He wanted to tell them that all those nights of practice had been worth it. After a while, his teacher came out holding a clipboard. She smiled when she saw him. "How did it go?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "They didn't say much." "That's normal," she said kindly. "Don't worry about the result. What matters is you played with your heart. That's what music is for." He nodded slowly, though his chest still ached with doubt. They walked together to the bus stop. The city noise surrounded them. Cars honking, people talking, footsteps echoing on the pavement. The boy looked around at the tall buildings and the busy streets. Everything seemed too big, too fast. He missed home already. When they reached the stop, his teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did something special today," she said. "No matter what happens, remember that." He smiled faintly. "Thank you." The bus ride back felt longer than before. He kept replaying the performance in his head, hearing every note, every mistake. What if the judges only pretended to be impressed? What if the director had only asked him to play again to prove how bad he was? Those thoughts kept circling in his mind until he finally fell asleep against the window. When he reached home, his mother was waiting at the door. "How was it?" she asked the moment he stepped inside. He didn't know how to answer. "I think, okay," he said. She hugged him tightly. "That's enough. You did your best." His father came in from the workshop, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Tell us everything," he said eagerly. The boy smiled a little and began describing the big hall, the shiny pianos, and the judges' serious faces. He told them how nervous he was, how his hands shook, and how the director had looked angry at first. When he mentioned that the director asked him to play again, his father's eyes widened. "He did? That's good, son. That means he saw something in you." "Maybe," the boy said quietly. "Or maybe he just wanted to test me." His father shook his head. "No one asks for more unless they're curious, and curiosity means interest." That night, the boy couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of crickets outside. The city lights were far behind him now, but the memory of that big hall stayed in his mind. He could still feel the weight of all those eyes on him and hear the echo of his own music fading into silence. He whispered to himself, "Even if they reject me, I'll still play. I'll never stop." The next morning, he woke up early and went to the small community park. He set up his old keyboard on a wooden bench and started playing. The sound carried through the empty park. Slowly, people walking by stopped to listen. Some smiled, some nodded along. A little girl clapped her hands in rhythm. When he finished, an old man approached him and said, "That's beautiful, son. You play with feeling." The boy thanked him. Even though the audition still weighed on his mind, hearing those words warmed his heart. Days turned into weeks. The boy went back to his normal routine: school, chores, practice. He didn't hear anything from the academy. Each day his hope dimmed a little, but he never stopped playing. Then one afternoon, while he was repairing a broken wire on his keyboard, there was a knock at the door. His mother opened it, and there stood a man in a suit holding a small envelope. "Is this the home of the boy who played at the academy audition?" the man asked politely. "Yes," his mother said quickly, calling for her son. The boy came running, wiping his hands on a cloth. The man handed him the envelope. "The academy asked me to deliver this," he said. "Congratulations," the boy froze. His heart jumped. "Congratulations," he repeated. The man smiled. "You'll understand when you read it." Then he turned and left. With shaking hands, the boy opened the envelope. Inside was a letter with the academy's seal. His eyes ran over the words again and again before he could even believe them. He had been selected. Not only that, but the academy had offered him a full scholarship. The letter mentioned that the director himself had recommended him, calling his performance a reminder of what true music sounds like. Tears filled his eyes. He handed the letter to his parents, who read it in silence before pulling him into a tight hug. His father's voice broke a little as he said, "I told you, son." They saw what we saw. That night the whole neighborhood came to celebrate. The same people who once laughed at his broken piano now came to shake his hand. Someone brought sweets, another brought drinks, and everyone talked about how proud they were. The old lady across the street said, "Didn't I tell you? That boy's music comes from his soul." The boy smiled shyly, but deep down he felt something even stronger. Gratitude, not just for being chosen, but for every struggle that had brought him to that moment. Later that night, when the noise had quieted and everyone had gone home, he sat alone with his little keyboard. He touched the worn keys gently and whispered, "We did it." He began to play softly, a new tune this time, one filled with joy, hope, and peace. The sound floated through the open window into the cool night air. His mother listened from the next room, smiling through tears. In that moment he realized something. The director's sneer, the laughter of strangers, the long nights, and the broken keys, they were all part of his story. Without them, his music would never have had its soul. The stars outside seemed brighter that night, as if they were listening too. And though he didn't know what awaited him at the academy, one thing was clear. His journey had only just begun. He looked at his hands, still rough from years of practice, and said softly to himself, "Next time, I'll make them feel even more." The old keyboard let out a small crackle, almost like it was answering him. He smiled. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was his voice, his companion, and his proof that no dream is too small if you keep believing in it. The next morning felt like a dream. The boy woke up before sunrise, still half expecting the letter from the academy to disappear. He took it out from under his pillow and read it again just to make sure it was real. The words still made his hands tremble. "You have been selected to join the City Music Academy on a full scholarship." His mother called him for breakfast, but he could barely eat. He sat quietly, the letter folded neatly beside his plate. His father, sipping tea, smiled and said, "You did it, son. But remember, this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." The boy nodded. He knew his father was right. Getting in was one thing. Proving he belonged there, that would be something else entirely. Over the next few days, the whole neighborhood helped him prepare. Someone offered an old suitcase, another gave a pair of shoes that looked almost new. His teacher visited and brought him some sheet music, even though he still preferred to play by ear. "It will help you," she said gently. "At the academy, everyone reads music. You should too." When the day finally came, his parents took him to the bus station. His mother hugged him tightly, whispering, "Don't forget where you come from. Play with the same heart you always did." He smiled through the tears. "I will." The city looked different this time. Not frightening, but full of promise. The academy's gates stood tall and shining in the morning sun. Dozens of students walked in with their instruments, violins, flutes, guitars, and pianos. Everyone seemed confident, focused, and polished. The boy felt a nervous flutter in his chest as he stepped through the gates carrying his patched-up keyboard in its cloth bag. Inside, the walls were covered with pictures of famous musicians, people who had once studied there and now played on big stages around the world. He stopped to look at them, wondering if he'd ever be like them someday. A woman from the administration office welcomed him kindly and handed him a paper with his class schedule. You'll start in Group C, she said. That's the beginner level for piano, though some of the students have already been trained. He thanked her and went to find his room. The hallway was filled with music, scales, melodies, and chords coming from behind different doors. Every sound reminded him how much he still had to learn. When he reached his classroom, he paused at the door. Inside were about 10 other students, each sitting at a sleek digital piano. The teacher, a young man with glasses, was writing something on the board. The boy quietly took a seat in the back corner and placed his small keyboard on the desk. When the teacher turned and saw it, he looked surprised. "Ah, you must be the new student," he said. "You brought your own instrument?" "Yes, sir," the boy said softly. The teacher smiled politely but seemed unsure what to make of it. "Well, we'll make it work," he said. "Welcome to the academy." The class began with basic exercises and finger stretches, scales, and rhythm patterns. The boy followed as best as he could, though his keys didn't sound as rich as the others. A few students glanced at him and whispered, but he pretended not to notice. At lunch, he sat alone under a tree outside, eating from a small lunchbox his mother had packed. A group of students nearby laughed loudly, sharing stories about expensive music tutors and concerts they'd attended abroad. He listened quietly, feeling a little out of place. Still, he wasn't discouraged. He remembered his father's words, and the real work starts now. Every evening after class, when others went out or relaxed, he stayed in the empty music room to practice. The janitor would sometimes peek in and shake his head with a smile. "Still at it, kid?" The boy would grin. "Just one more song." Sometimes he stayed until the lights flickered off, playing until his fingers were sore. He wasn't the fastest learner, but what he lacked in technique he made up for with heart. Each night he replayed the melodies from class, trying to add his own twist, his own story. One day the academy announced that the students would have a midterm performance. Each group had to present one piece in front of the faculty, including the director himself. The boy's heart leapt when he heard the news. It was his chance to prove he deserved to be there. The teacher assigned everyone a classical piece to practice. When it was the boy's turn, the teacher said, "You'll be playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It's emotional and simple enough to fit your style." The boy nodded. He'd never played Beethoven before, but the title alone felt right. Every night he practiced that piece until the notes flowed like water. At first he struggled with the timing, the rhythm, the expression, but slowly it started to sound like something more than just a song. It became a feeling, a story of his own. A week before the performance, the teacher asked everyone to play their piece in class as a practice run. When it was the boy's turn, he placed his small keyboard on the stand and began to play. The familiar crackle from the old speaker filled the room, but as soon as the melody started, the class went quiet. He played gently, with closed eyes, letting the music speak for him. When he finished, the room stayed still for a moment. Then the teacher said softly, "That was beautiful." The students clapped politely, and one girl said, "How does it sound so emotional on that thing?" The boy smiled shyly. "It's not the piano," he said. "It's what you feel when you play it." The teacher nodded. Exactly. Finally, the day of the midterm arrived. The large performance hall was packed with students, teachers, and academy staff. The director sat in the front row, the same man who had once sneered at the sight of the boy's piano. He didn't seem to notice the boy as he walked onto the stage carrying his instrument. When the announcer called his name, a small ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Some remembered him as the boy with the homemade piano from the audition. Others were curious to see if the story had been true. He placed his keyboard down, adjusted the small speaker, and took a deep breath. For a brief second, he thought about everything: his parents, his teacher, his late nights in that dim room, and the first time he ever touched a broken key. Then he closed his eyes and began to play. The sound that filled the hall wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Each note of Moonlight Sonata seemed to glow softly in the air. It carried a quiet sadness, a hope, a dream. The audience leaned forward, caught in the calm rhythm that felt both fragile and powerful. Halfway through, the director leaned his chin on his hand, his eyes narrowing. He remembered that same boy standing in front of him months ago, trembling but determined. He could hear the difference now. The growth, the depth, the control. When the final note faded, the silence returned once more. Then slowly the applause began. It started with one person, then another, until the whole hall was clapping. The boy stood up, a little stunned. and bowed. The director didn't smile, but he nodded slightly. A small, approving gesture that meant more than any words could. After the performance, as the students gathered backstage, the teacher came to him and said, "The director was impressed." He doesn't say it, but I could see it in his eyes. The boy grinned. "Really?" "Yes," the teacher said. "Keep playing like that, and one day he'll say it out loud." The boy laughed softly, relief washing over him. Later that night, he sat alone in his dorm room, looking at his old keyboard under the lamplight. He ran his fingers across the faded keys. The same instrument that once drew laughter had now earned him respect. He didn't feel proud in a loud way. It was more like a quiet joy, the kind that fills your chest slowly and warms you from the inside. He whispered to himself, "We're getting there." Then he played again, not for grades, not for applause, but simply because he loved it. The music floated out the open window, reaching into the night air. In another part of the building, the director was walking down the hallway when he stopped. He heard the faint melody and smiled to himself. For the first time in years, he remembered why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. He stood there for a moment, listening to a boy, his old piano, and a dream that refused to fade. The day of the big performance finally came. The city theater was buzzing with people. The posters outside showed the names of famous musicians, all neatly printed in bold letters. Somewhere at the bottom, barely noticeable, was the name of the newcomer, the young man with the strange piano. He arrived early, holding the small keyboard carefully in his hands. The instrument was wrapped in a plain black cloth, almost like a secret. The other performers glanced at him and whispered among themselves. Some smirked, others simply ignored him. He didn't care. His mind was calm. He had spent years preparing for this. The stage lights were being tested when the director walked in. His sharp eyes immediately found the young man standing near the side of the stage. "You again?" he said with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I still can't believe that's what you're performing on." The young man simply smiled back. "You'll hear soon enough, sir." The director laughed under his breath and walked away, shaking his head. But he paused for a moment before leaving the stage. Something about the young man's calm expression made him curious, though he would never admit it. As time passed, the theater filled up completely. The audience was made up of music lovers, critics, and teachers. Some people had traveled from far away to see the performances. Everyone was dressed neatly, waiting for the night to begin. The lights dimmed. The curtains opened. The first few performers played beautifully. A young woman performed a classical sonata on a grand piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. The audience clapped politely after each piece. Then came a violinist, a cellist, and even a small orchestra. Every note echoed perfectly in the large hall. Backstage, the young man watched quietly. His hands were warm but steady. He took deep breaths, not out of fear but focus. When the announcer finally called his name, a few people in the audience turned to each other and whispered. Many hadn't even heard of him. He walked to the center of the stage carrying his small keyboard. The moment he placed it on the stand, laughter rippled through the room. Someone in the back muttered, "What is that, a toy?" Even the director sitting near the front leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Unbelievable," he said under his breath. The young man stood still for a moment, letting the noise fade. He looked at the audience and smiled softly. Then, without saying a word, he pressed the first key. A single note filled the room, a soft, clear, and strangely deep. People stopped whispering. Then another note followed, and another. Slowly, a melody began to form, one that was both simple and haunting. It wasn't the kind of piece anyone expected. It sounded almost like the wind moving through an old forest or the gentle hum of rain touching glass. The young man closed his eyes as he played. His fingers moved with a rhythm that seemed natural, effortless. Each sound was perfectly placed, not too loud, not too soft. The strange little instrument began to sound like something far greater than itself, like a living voice. As the music grew, something changed in the audience. The laughter stopped completely. People leaned forward in their seats. Some even held their breath. The melody carried emotion that couldn't be explained. Sadness, hope, loss, and peace all woven together. The director's smile faded. He sat up straight, staring at the stage with wide eyes. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It didn't make sense. The instrument looked like nothing more than a cheap keyboard, yet the sound, it was pure magic. The young man played as if the world around him no longer existed. The stage lights reflected softly on his face, showing deep focus and quiet joy. Every note told a story about struggle, loneliness, and the strength to keep going. By the time the final chord echoed through the hall, the audience was silent. The sound hung in the air for a long moment, as if even the walls were listening. Then came the applause, slow at first, then louder until the entire room stood on its feet. The young man looked up, surprised for the first time that night. He had expected polite clapping, maybe even a few smiles. But this was something else. People were cheering, whistling, shouting his name. The director stood too, clapping harder than anyone. He wasn't just impressed, he was speechless. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. After the curtain fell, the young man walked backstage. Performers who had ignored him earlier now surrounded him, asking questions, praising him. Some even wanted to touch the instrument to see if it was real. He smiled humbly and answered as best he could. When the noise died down, the director approached. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the director said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The young man shook his head. "You don't," he said kindly. "I know it looked strange, but the sound," the director said, looking at the keyboard as if it were some kind of miracle. "How did you—" "It's not the piano," the young man interrupted softly. "It's how you feel when you play." The director nodded slowly, his expression softening. "You've reminded me why I started in music in the first place," he said. The young man smiled again. "That means more than any applause." Later that night, after everyone left, he stayed behind in the empty hall. The seats were dark, the stage lights dimmed. He sat at the edge of the stage, his keyboard beside him, and listened to the quiet. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that comes only after something meaningful happens. He thought about the years he had spent being told he would never make it. He remembered the long nights practicing in small rooms, the times he had no money, the moments he wanted to quit, and yet here he was, standing where no one thought he'd belong. He touched the keys again, playing softly to himself. No one was there to listen, but that didn't matter. He wasn't playing for anyone else this time. He was playing for the boy who never gave up, the boy who believed that music wasn't about fancy instruments or big names. It was about heart. Somewhere high in the balcony, a janitor stopped sweeping to listen. For a few minutes, the hall filled once more with that same gentle, pure melody. When the last note faded, the janitor clapped quietly to himself, smiling. The young man looked up and laughed softly. "Thank you," he said. Then he packed up his keyboard and walked out into the night. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and he breathed in the cool air. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the echo of his own music still ringing in his ears. He didn't know what would come next. Maybe new opportunities, maybe new struggles. But one thing was clear. That night had changed everything. People would remember him not because of the instrument he played, but because of what they felt when he played it. And somewhere deep down he knew that was enough. The morning after the performance felt almost unreal. The young man woke up to the soft light slipping through his curtains. For a moment, he thought everything that had happened was just a dream. The applause, the standing ovation, the look on the director's face. But when he checked his phone, he realized it was all real. Messages filled his inbox. Some were from people who had been in the audience. Others were from musicians he had admired for years. Words like incredible, unbelievable, and life-changing appeared again and again. He sat on the edge of his bed, reading in silence. He felt grateful, but also strangely calm. Fame or recognition had never been his goal. All he wanted was to be heard. And finally, he had been. A few hours later, the director called. "We need to talk," he said, his voice more serious than before. When the young man arrived at the theater, the director was waiting in the lobby, holding a newspaper. Right on the front page was a picture of the young man sitting at his little keyboard, eyes closed, playing with deep emotion. The headline read, "The Boy Who Made the City Listen." The director smiled. "You've made history, my friend," he said, handing over the paper. "You've done something no one has done before. Made people forget about the size of an instrument and remember the power of feeling." The young man laughed quietly. "That's all I wanted to do." The director led him inside and said, There are more invitations. Other cities, other halls. People want to hear you. They want to see that piano of yours. For a second, the young man didn't know how to respond. Traveling around the country to perform sounded like a dream, but it also scared him. He wasn't sure if he could handle that kind of attention. The director seemed to read his mind. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "Just play the way you always do. That's what people fell in love with." After a pause, the young man nodded. "All right, let's do it." And just like that, a new chapter of his life began. Over the next few months, he traveled from city to city with his small keyboard. Each place had its own kind of audience, some large, some small. But every time it was the same reaction. People came in curious, sometimes skeptical, and left with tears in their eyes. He didn't need big lighting or a band behind him. Just a chair, his little piano, and a quiet moment before he began. The sound spoke for itself. News spread quickly. Music blogs wrote about him. Social media clips of his performances went viral. People started calling him the heart pianist. It wasn't a name he chose, but it fit. Still, he stayed humble. He traveled light, often staying in small guest houses, eating simple meals, and spending most of his time practicing. To him, music wasn't a show. It was a conversation. One evening, after a concert in a quiet town, an old man approached him backstage. He was holding a small photo in his hand. "That song you played tonight," the man said, his voice trembling. "It reminded me of my late wife. She used to hum something just like it." He showed the young man the photo, a woman smiling in a garden. "Thank you," the man whispered. For a few minutes, it felt like she was here again. The young man didn't know what to say. He just reached out, held the man's hand, and smiled. Moments like that became the true reward for him. Every show brought a new story. A child who wanted to learn music. A mother who said her son slept peacefully for the first time in weeks after hearing his song. An old teacher who said his playing reminded her why she loved music in the first place. But with fame came pressure too. Some concert organizers began suggesting changes. They wanted him to perform with orchestras, to use fancier instruments, to wear formal clothes. One night, after a long meeting about making the show more professional, he sat alone in his hotel room, staring at his small keyboard. He felt distant from himself. He thought about the little boy who once played on broken keys in a dusty room, just because he loved the sound. He thought about the nights when music was his only friend. That memory gave him strength again. He picked up his phone and called the director. "I can't do it," he said honestly. "They want to change everything. The music, the setup, even the way I sit on stage." The director was silent for a moment. Then he said gently, "Then don't. You've come this far by being yourself. Don't lose that now." The young man smiled faintly. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." From that moment, he decided to stay true to his style. He turned down offers that didn't feel right. He chose small halls over big arenas and live emotion over loud showmanship. One day, he received a letter from an international music festival. They wanted him to perform on the main stage, the same event where some of the world's most famous pianists would play. He hesitated at first, but the director encouraged him. "This is your time," he said. "Show them that music isn't about what's expensive or shiny. It's about soul." The young man agreed. When the day of the festival arrived, he found himself surrounded by tall banners, flashing lights, and a crowd of thousands. Backstage, the atmosphere was busy and loud. Assistants ran around, tuning grand pianos, setting up cameras. He looked down at his small keyboard and smiled. Some of the other performers glanced at it and whispered, just like that first night. It didn't bother him anymore. He knew what he carried, and not just an instrument, but a story. When his turn came, he walked onto the stage. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, but he could feel their energy in a mix of curiosity and doubt. He sat down, placed his hands gently on the keys, and began to play. This time, the piece he chose was new, one he had written during his travels. It was a story in sound, about hope, patience, and the courage to stay true to yourself. The melody started soft, almost like a whisper. Slowly it grew stronger, building layers of emotion. Every note felt alive, carrying pieces of his journey. The laughter, the loneliness, the late nights, the people he met. Halfway through, something changed. The sound seemed to fill not just the hall, but every heart in it. People who had come expecting another classical performance found themselves moved in ways they couldn't explain. When he played the final note, the crowd didn't move. The silence that followed was deep, almost sacred. Then, like a wave, applause broke out. Not just polite clapping, but cheers, tears, and standing ovations. The young man looked up and for the first time saw the director standing in the crowd. His eyes were wet, his hands pressed together in quiet pride. Later that night after the show, the young man stood on the balcony of his small hotel room, looking out at the city lights. He felt no excitement, no rush, just peace. He had proven something not to others but to himself. That no matter how simple something looks, what truly matters is the heart behind it. He took his small keyboard out of its case, set it on the balcony rail, and began to play softly to the night sky. The music floated through the air, pure, gentle, and full of life. Down below, people passing by stopped to listen. None of them knew who he was. They didn't see a famous performer, just a man playing music that touched the heart, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Years passed, and the young man's music continued to travel further than he ever could. People shared his performances across countries and languages. His little keyboard became a symbol of something greater, a reminder that real beauty isn't about perfection but honesty. He never saw himself as famous, though. Fame didn't fit him. He was still the same person who had once sat in a small room, playing quietly while the world outside didn't notice. The only difference was that now, the world finally listened. He moved to a small house near the edge of a lake, a peaceful place where the days passed slowly, and the nights were filled with the sound of crickets and wind. Sometimes he performed in nearby towns, but most of the time, he spent his days teaching music to children who couldn't afford lessons. He told them stories about how music had saved him when nothing else could. He taught them that it wasn't about being perfect or rich, but about feeling every sound. One afternoon, while sitting with a group of students, one little girl asked, "Sir, why do you play such a small piano when you could buy a big one now?" He smiled at her question. "Because this one taught me everything," he said gently. "It taught me that you don't need much to create something that means a lot." The children looked at him curiously. Then he turned the keyboard on and started playing a small tune, something light and happy. The children clapped along, laughing and smiling. To them, it wasn't just music. It was magic. After class, he sat alone by the lake watching the water move softly in the breeze. He thought about how far he had come. The struggles, the rejection, the director's harsh words, all of it felt distant now, almost like another lifetime. Still, every now and then, he thought about that night, the first big performance when the director sneered and said, "You call that a piano?" It had hurt him deeply then, but it had also lit a fire inside him. Without that moment, he might never have discovered his full strength. He wondered where the director was now. It had been years since they last spoke. The thought made him smile softly. Maybe it was time to find out. That evening, he called the old theater and asked about him. The receptionist told him that the director had retired a few years ago and was now living quietly in the countryside. Something inside the young man said he should visit. Not for any reason other than gratitude. The next morning, he packed his small keyboard, took a train, and traveled to a quiet village where the director lived. The road was lined with trees and golden leaves. The air was crisp and every step felt like walking through memories. When he reached the house, an older man answered the door. His hair had turned silver and his voice was weaker than before, but his eyes still held that sharpness of a man who had seen everything. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the older man smiled faintly and said, "You've aged well, my friend. I never thought you'd remember an old fool like me." The younger man laughed softly. "You weren't a fool, sir. You taught me something very important." "Oh," the director said, raising an eyebrow. "You taught me that sometimes people will laugh at what they don't understand," he said. "And that's okay because the truth doesn't need everyone's approval to be real." The director chuckled and nodded. "That sounds like something I should have said years ago," he murmured. Come in, come in." Inside the small house, the walls were filled with old posters from past concerts. Dust covered the frames, but the memories remained bright. The two sat by a window with cups of tea. The director looked at him for a long time and said quietly, "You know, that night changed me too. I'd spent years judging musicians by their tools, by the size of their pianos or the fame of their names. But when you played, I realized I'd forgotten what music truly meant." The young man smiled. "Music doesn't need to be grand. It just needs to be true." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the director asked softly, "Do you still have that little piano of yours?" The young man nodded. "Always. Would you play for me? Just once more?" Without a word, he opened his bag and set the small keyboard on the table. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. Then, gently, he began to play. The melody was warm and tender, carrying years of memories within it. The director closed his eyes and leaned back, listening with a faint smile. It was the same sound as before, pure, honest, and alive. When the song ended, the director opened his eyes, tears glistening in them. "You've done well," he whispered. "You've made the world remember what heart sounds like." They talked until the sun began to set. Old stories, shared laughs, quiet moments. Before leaving, the young man thanked him one last time. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," he said sincerely. As he stepped outside, the evening light painted the world in shades of gold. The director stood at the door, watching him go, his eyes soft and proud. The young man walked down the narrow road, his little keyboard slung over his shoulder, feeling lighter than ever. He had come full circle, from being laughed at, to being loved, to giving back. That night, back at his lake house, he sat on the porch, looking at the stars reflected in the water. The air was cool and quiet. He turned on his keyboard and started to play again, this time for no audience at all. The melody floated into the night, gentle, slow, full of gratitude. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation with life itself. Somewhere in the distance he heard laughter from the children he taught during the day. He smiled. The sound of their joy mixed perfectly with the music. As he played, he thought about everything music had given him. Not money or fame, but peace, connection, and meaning. He thought about all the people who had told him he couldn't make it, and he silently thanked them too, because their doubt had become his strength. The stars shone brighter above him. The water rippled softly. His fingers kept moving slow and steady as if they were writing a letter to the world through sound. When he finally stopped, he whispered to himself, "It was never about proving anyone wrong. It was always about finding the truth inside the sound." He smiled, closed the keyboard, and leaned back in his chair, watching the sky. Somewhere deep in his heart, he felt a quiet certainty that the world would forget many things over time, but it would not forget the feeling of that little piano. Because sometimes, greatness doesn't come from grand stages or shining lights. It comes from someone who dares to stay true to themselves, even when the world doesn't understand. And so, the story of the boy and his small piano lived on, not in newspapers or on screens, but in every heart that had ever been touched by his music. Every note he had ever played still floated somewhere out there, carried by the wind, finding its way into new ears, new hearts, new dreams. And if you listened closely enough, on a quiet night by the lake, you could still hear it, soft, clear, and full of life. The same piano the director once sneered at, the same sound that changed everything, the same truth that would never fade.